It did not take Notre Dame long to find its replacement for Brian Kelly. He was right on campus, and we will find out from Brian Driskell of Irish Breakdown whether that was the right move to make, as Marcus Freeman has been announced as the new head coach at Notre Dame. Brian, how you doing today?
I'm tired. It's been a busy. I thought the biggest thing we'd have to talk about this week, I thought was going to be that USC, Notre Dame's big rival, hired Lincoln Riley, and then Brian Kelly was like, "Hold my beer," So then the next 3 days have been a little wild, but it's been a lot of fun, and ultimately it ended the way that I think most Notre Dame fans wanted it to end.
The way news cycles work in this type of situation, the original news of Brian Kelly leaving Notre Dame seems like, ages ago. So that's not what's current. But since I haven't had a chance to talk to you since it all hit, I want to start from the beginning. And that's Brian Kelly leaving Notre Dame for LSU. Were you shocked? And do you think that really makes sense? And have you worked through what his incentives and motivations are?
I'm not shocked that he left. Mark, I've kind of talked a while that I could see the next. I never thought he was going to get to his extension end date. I never thought he'd get to 2024. I thought, if they had a really good year this year, or perhaps after next year, that he would walk away. And I thought he'd kind of retire. Is kind of what a lot of people thought. But I think the last year or two, he's kind of got a second wind as a coach. He looks at it. I'm 60 years old, and even if I get to the end of my contract at Notre Dame, I'm only going to be 63, and I'm still 10 years younger than Nick Saban. And I still think he had the juices, and I think he was just looking for a new challenge. I think he felt that Notre Dame had gone as far as it could go, whereas I would argue Notre Dame has gone as far as he can take it, and that's two different things. And so I just feel like it was more about that. I think he looks around and he sees all these coaches getting all these big salaries. Notre Dame was not willing to renegotiate his contract again, which they did less than a year ago, and just LSU was willing to give him that money. So I think the opportunity to get a title that he didn't think he could win at Notre Dame, and then, of course, to get a huge contract, guaranteed contract, a lot of it being guaranteed, I think that's really what it boiled down to.
Brian, you hit on what has become one of the great discussions and debates in college football, and that's whether Notre Dame is elite and just hasn't pushed across, or whether there still is distance between the elite and where Notre Dame stands right now. What's ironic, of course, is Brian Kelly has brought this program to a place where it's not as though he had reached a certain point and then there was a plateau, or he had reached a certain point and there was some decline, but it wasn't too egregious to get him fired. No, this program is arguably in the best place it's been during his 12-year tenure, and bringing in what would have been, and if Marcus Freeman can hold it together, the fourth best recruiting class in the country 13 days from now.
And their 2023 class is off to an even better start than that class was. I mean, a week ago, Mark, like literally a week ago, I think it was last Thursday, we did a show on our podcast at Irish Breakdown where we said we feel like this is Notre Dame's most dangerous team heading into the postseason. That if they can get to a playoff game, the combination of how good they're playing right now and their talent level, with the fact that there is no 2020 Bama or 2019 LSU or 2018 Clemson, meaning teams that not only have great defenses but elite offenses, that it sets up well. They match up much better against the top teams in the playoff this year than they did last year or in 2019 or in 2018. Because if they'd have played LSU in the playoff in 2019, the same thing would have happened to what happened to them when they played, Alabama in 2012 or Alabama in 2020. And that's the team you walk away from, and it just says, but you know what though, Mark, you have to look at Brian Kelly's mindset, right? Like in the preseason, you had me on, we talked about on our show. I thought this is what Notre Dame should have been. Notre Dame should have been an 11-0. I mean, should be 12-0. I mean, you lose at home to Cincinnati by 11. You should, your team wasn't prepared for that game. But the whole thing was, and Joel Klatt made this very clear last week during an interview. He said that Brian Kelly was telling people back in September that this is a rebuild. He said, this isn't our year. This is a rebuilding year. I'm like, what? Like, how did you look at the schedule you were going to face and look at that as a rebuilding year with the talent you have coming back? And I think when you look at your team that way, I don't think he ever come to grips with the fact that this team's pretty good and the rest of college football's not as good as it's been in the past. And I think that lack of a real vision and a real understanding of how good his team is just led him to believe that there was something better out there. And I have a feeling he's going to be in a situation in 3 or 4 years where he realizes the grass isn't always greener on the other side. And if you think I was hard on you in the media, wait till you drop a couple games you're not supposed to drop at LSU. So I think ultimately that's what it came down to. I don't think he thought this team was as good as I think it is, and the players think it is, to be honest with you.
Just from the standpoint of environment, culture, all of that taken into consideration, and maybe I'm just short-sighted, and maybe he's a more flexible, adaptable individual than I give him credit for. Just if that would have been Brian Kelly to, and forget the coaching situations out there, Brian Kelly to Michigan, Brian Kelly to Stanford, Brian Kelly to USC, a few other places.
Florida.
Florida, with the academic standards there. When I heard Brian Kelly LSU, that's a marriage I would have never in my wildest dreams come up with.
Of all the power programs, right? The 15, 20 top programs, LSU would have been one of my last 1 or 2 that I would have seen as a fit for Brian Kelly. When you're talking about a guy that's from Boston, Massachusetts, to spend his whole career coaching in either, Michigan or Indiana or Ohio. I mean, that's it. And you listen to Brian Kelly talk, you look at how he dresses, you look at the things he enjoys. None of those are criticisms. It's just an observation.
Sure.
And then you think of, is that really going to fit in Louisiana? I don't know that it will. And that's not an insult. It's I wouldn't fit in a big city. I wouldn't fit in New York City or LA or Chicago. It's just some people are fits for certain places. The fit doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And the work that he's going to have to put in on the recruiting trail, those are going to require him to do things he never really did at Notre Dame. And that's the thing that kind of I found puzzling. So the timing of him leaving and the school he chose was more shocking to me than the fact that he left Notre Dame.
Brian Driskell on the line from Irish Breakdown. Notre Dame fans, I got to think, Notre Dame fans, any that are listening to this conversation know exactly who Bryan is and Irish Breakdown. If you don't, search it as soon as you get done watching this video. Irish Breakdown right here on YouTube. Audio podcast as well. Favorite audio platform, go to it and look it up and find it. Even if you're not a Notre Dame fan, if you just enjoy great college football content and you're one of these nerds like myself that you just got to track all the big programs, then again, Brian Driskell, Irish Breakdown, got to be there. Okay.
And we do a Friday mailbag every week where if you're a fan of another team and you want our opinion of your team or something else, feel free.
Nice.
We answer all your questions.
Good stuff. So then the announcement comes, Marcus Freeman. We'll skip all the conjecture, of who else was a candidate and so forth, because that's long gone. It is Marcus Freeman. So was the response from you joy, satisfaction, dissatisfaction?
Well, it depends on which version of me you're asking. If you're asking me as a Notre Dame fan, it was joy. It was excitement. It was, the energy. Marcus Freeman brings sort of he steps into the room and you're just like, okay, hold on, let me sit up in my seat a little bit. I'm ready to go. And it's just, fresh blood, different voice, different everything. As an analyst, I looked at it and then I said, I look at all the potential coaches that could have been there that you could have gone after. And I said, you have to come to accept 2 realities when you're looking at Marcus Freeman. Is he the right candidate from an objective, football standpoint? Number one is you have to accept the fact that he has the lowest floor of all the coaches on there because of the lack of experience. He's never done it. You also, I believe, have to accept the fact that, or be willing to look past that and accept the fact that he also has the high ceiling. And I think that's what Jack Swarbrick is banking on is, look, we're going to keep a staff in place. Being able to keep Mike Elson was huge. Keeping Tommy Reeves was big. Keeping Matt Bayless, the strength coach, was big. There's going to be some continuity there, but you're banking on the fact that his dynamic personality, his ability to recruit, and then beyond that, his attention to detail as a defensive coordinator, his ability to connect with players, even little things like early in the season, Coach had made a couple calls, because he was still getting used to the players and they had changed some terminology from what he'd done in the past. He had made a couple calls that were mistakes. Like he meant to combine a couple things, and it resulted in a 67-yard run. So what I was told by a couple sources that know people that were on the sideline is, in the past, players are used to when you make a big mistake, you come off and the coaches yell at you. And he got in front of the whole defense and was like, that was on me. That was my mistake. Let's fix this. And then the next week did some things to make sure it didn't happen again. And to have a coach take accountability for his mistake and then say, I'm going to fix it, and then to go out and fix it, is just something that really resonates. And it may seem like a little thing to us, but for players, that was a huge thing. There was a level of trust there that's so important for a coach. Very organized, very detailed, very they're very structured. There's a purpose to everything he does, and they're all those traits translate to, can he do that with an entire program? We don't know but a lot of those traits, because here's what I don't care about for a head coach. I don't care if you're a dynamic recruiter, in that it's not a top 2 or 3 thing. Because if you're a dynamic recruiter, but you don't have 4 or 5 other things, it won't matter. You won't be a good coach. And I don't care about a guy that's high energy. Those are all nice things to have, icing on the cake things to have. But the planning, the organization, the detail, the ability to instruct, the ability to get 100, 200 people that are all part of your football operation focused on the same objective and working in the same direction is not an easy thing to do. And it's those traits that make me think Marcus Freeman could be successful. Then you add on the recruiting, the personality, the youth, and all that. I think it makes it an even more exciting thing. Like, all of a sudden, Notre Dame is the young, hip team. They've got a 35-year-old head coach, a 29-year-old offensive coordinator, right? Like, Mike Elson's the seasoned vet at 46, right? Like so, I mean, I think you kind of needed to take a chance on something like that if you're Notre Dame, to take that next step as a program.
Is it possible that Jack Swarbrick made a decision that he would have been more comfortable with making 2 or 3 years from now, with Marcus Freeman having a little bit more experience, but did not want to lose him, therefore maybe is reaching just a bit to make sure he has what he wants?
It's a really good way of putting it. I don't think that Jack feels he's reaching. I think, of course, Jack would have, from everything that I've been told, the only thing that didn't make it an immediate hire was the fact that Coach Freeman doesn't have experience. So yes, and also this was a perfect year for Notre Dame to be making a coaching hire. And Mark, you've been doing this a long time. I mean, you're the voice of college football. You know that timing of replacing a coach is huge, because it may be like, look, Lincoln Riley's already gone, right? Like, Billy Napier's already gone. Dave Aranda's not I mean, there's some dominoes that already fallen, right? And it could have been a bad year, but you've got a Luke Fickell. You've got Jeff Brom having a big year. You've got Matt Campbell still out there. I mean, that you've got Bob Stoops, still a guy that my sources have said the last couple of years had said if that job came open, he'd be interested. He's an Ohio Catholic, guy. So it was actually a good year to be out there, to where if you were uncomfortable with Marcus Freeman's lack of experience, there were other good candidates you could have gone to. From what I'm told, at the end of the day, Jack just kept coming back to the fact that there's one con. Like, you make a pro-con list, there's one con: he doesn't have experience. And then there's this long list of pros. And am I going to allow that one con to have us miss? Because I do think Jack expected Brian Kelly to be here another year or two, and then Marcus would make a real smooth transition. So I don't think it was a panic move of, gee, I got to hire him or I'm going to lose him. I think he just felt Marcus was the best man for the job. But if he could have had it his own way, he would have liked to let him cook a little bit longer,
Sure.
under Brian Kelly.
Bryan Driskell, Irish Breakdown, helping us sort out this situation. Of course, Brian Kelly, on his way to LSU, has already been announced as head coach, and Marcus Freeman taking the reins at Notre Dame. So this recruiting class we have mentioned as being one of the best in the country. What is your confidence level in Marcus Freeman being able to retain that class?
Well, the defensive class is going to stay intact. I mean, of the kids that have already stayed, Devin Moore decommitted the day that Brian Kelly left, but he had an in-home visit with Florida before the news leaked that Brian Kelly was even on LSU's radar. So I think that was kind of already in the works. The defensive staff, I'm told from talking to several sources, it's going to stay intact. The defensive class. The offensive class, CJ Williams was sort of on the fence even before Brian Kelly left. They've got to work to keep him in the class. I'm not overly concerned about anybody else in the class other than people that were already on the fence. Maureen Walker looking at Michigan, CJ Williams looking at UCLA and USC. But those things were issues before Brian Kelly left. So other than that, I think they're going to keep this class intact. The 2023 class, I believe, because you kept Mike Elston and Marcus Freeman, I mean, the 2023 class is built around your 2 5-star defensive ends and an elite 5-star linebacker. You lose Mike Elston or Marcus Freeman, those guys are gone. So I think keeping those two is going to allow them to keep the 2023 class intact and together as well. Now, the next question is, can you finish strong? That's going to be the thing we're going to have to find out because they've only got 13 days to do it.
Where do you stand in taking off your blue and gold in regards to this recent thought and conversation concerning the college football playoff in Notre Dame without a head coach of sorts? Although now Marcus Freeman's in place, he just has to basically change the plaque on his desk, and he's good to go. So I'll just open it up to the overall conversation of Notre Dame's playoff chances, how they've been treated and viewed by the playoff committee to date, based on your estimation, and what dominoes need to fall besides the obvious this weekend.
Well, Gary Bard has said that Notre Dame not having a head coach did not impact last week's ranking. That was based off Notre Dame winning, other teams winning, Ohio State losing, and Wisconsin losing, because that hurt Notre Dame's, big win, so to speak. That it would potentially affect next week's ranking, the one that comes out on Sunday. Well, I think now that Notre Dame has this coach in place and the entire staff is staying, because if it was just Marcus Freeman, but then 8 of the coaches are leaving, that's not a real stable situation. They're going to have coaches interviewing for other jobs, looking around. I don't know if that's a team I would have wanted in the playoff. I think the fact that so much of the staff is staying intact is going to allow the committee to say, if at the end of the day Notre Dame is one of the 4 best teams, that's not going to be an issue. And if anything, and he did say this was interesting. He said, we've seen situations where like a quarterback goes down and the backup comes in and it provides a new sense of energy, or a backup running back comes in and they play even better. Saying like some people may look at it that way. And there's an energy around Notre Dame right now. Having said all that, that's not a resume builder. That's what just protects you from being dropped for something not having to do with your resume. When you look at Notre Dame's resume, they're 11-1. That's great. They've beaten all the teams they're playing. They're playing as good as anybody in the country not named Georgia right now, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, you look at it and say, if the roles were reversed and Notre Dame had 2 wins over top 15 teams like Oklahoma and Baylor and was about to have another one and go 12-1, and Oklahoma State was 11-1 with no wins over top 25 teams, Notre Dame fans would be losing their mind if they weren't ranked ahead of Oklahoma State, right? So if we're being fair, I'm fine with where Notre Dame is right now. The schedule ended up being softer than they thought it was going to be. Not a whole lot softer than what I thought it was going to be, because I didn't think North Carolina was going to be as good, but I didn't think they're going to be 6-6, not as good. You know what I mean? I didn't think Wisconsin was going to be that good. They didn't surprise me a whole lot. I thought it was strange that they went from 15 to unranked because of one game. That was a little strange to me, especially after I've watched Texas A&M lose 2 of their last 3 games and still stay in the top 25. And their one game they didn't lose is Prairie View A&M. That was a little confusing, but we understand why that happens. But I think Notre Dame is where they should be based on their resume. I also feel that if Georgia beats Alabama and Baylor beats Oklahoma State, Notre Dame should be in the playoff. I think they're one of the 4 best teams. I don't think they have one of the 4 best resumes right now.
Bryan, get some rest. We appreciate you stopping by.
I'm just asking Notre Dame, please, no commitments today, no more breaking news. Just give me 24 hours to catch some rest, catch some sleep, and get some nourishment, and I'll be good and ready to roll tomorrow.
Yeah, ready to roll on Saturday and hope for those dominoes to fall the right way.
Thanks for having me on, Mark.
Thanks, Bryan.